Malaysian billionaire Ong Beng Seng has been fined 30,000 Singapore dollars for abetting former Transport Minister S Iswaran in obstructing justice. He was not given a jail term due to his poor health. Jeraldine Yap with the details.
Arriving at the state courts once again, escorted by his staff and lawyers, property tycoon Ong Beng Seng navigated the media scrum slowly without addressing questions from reporters. The 79-year-old Malaysian had pleaded guilty to one count of abetting the obstruction of justice by arranging for former Singapore Transport Minister S Iswaran to repay the cost of a business-class flight in late 2022 from Doha to Singapore. The hearing started slightly earlier than scheduled, with Principal District Judge Lee Lit Ching outlining the central question in this case, whether the exercise of judicial mercy is warranted due to Ong's advanced multiple myeloma, an incurable form of blood cancer. Judge Lee said there was clear and undisputed medical evidence that jail time would increase the risk of endangering Ong's life. In particular, she said the risk of infection would increase significantly due to unavoidable interactions with rotating shifts of prison officers and medical staff. The risk of falls would also be heightened, as Ong would face disorientation in an unfamiliar environment and different routines without his usual caregivers. Judge Lee noted that while the Singapore Prison Service has an adequate healthcare system in place to manage inmates with serious and complex medical conditions, this does not address the enhanced risk of potentially fatal infections and falls. Ong's defence team had included in their submissions to the court reports from his doctors stating that he needs to continue to receive the same standard of care and access to his specialist medical team. Therefore, Judge Lee agreed with the prosecution and defence that judicial mercy was justified and imposed a fine of 30,000 Singapore dollars, the maximum amount a district court is allowed to give. She said the appropriate sentence for Ong would otherwise have been 3 months jail after taking into consideration his early guilty plea and lower culpability. Judge Lee noted that one might consider it unfair that an offender who can afford a higher standard of healthcare is better positioned to avoid jail time than someone less privileged. She said this view is misguided, and the critical question is whether imprisonment would create heightened risks to an offender's life. If a lower standard of healthcare in prison would not result in significantly higher risks, then she said there is no basis for exercising judicial mercy. After the sentencing, Ong paid the fine and left the state courts without stopping to speak to the media, only giving a brief wave.
Ong Beng Seng's sentencing in Singapore brings an end to a 2-year saga, first sparked by graft investigations into S Iswaran. We look at how the case unfolded. In July 2023, Singapore's anti-corruption agency announced that then Transport Minister Iswaran was assisting with an investigation. 3 days later, Hotel Properties Limited announced that Ong, the firm's co-founder, had been arrested in relation to the case. In January last year, Iswaran was handed 27 charges, including 2 for corruption and 1 for obstructing the course of justice. He pleaded not guilty and resigned from the government. 2 months later, he was handed 8 new charges. In September last year, Iswaran pleaded guilty after the 2 corruption charges were amended to lesser charges under Section 165 of the Penal Code, which forbids all public servants from obtaining gifts. He was convicted of 5 charges in total. About a week later, Iswaran was sentenced to 12 months jail. Before starting his jail term, he said he accepted full responsibility for his actions and apologized to all Singaporeans. The next day, Ong was handed 2 charges, one for abetting Iswaran in obtaining gifts as a public servant and the other for abetting him in obstruction of justice. This month, Ong pleaded guilty to abetting Iswaran in obstructing the course of justice. The businessman was fined $30,000 today. Now, Ong's Singapore permanent residence status is now under review following his conviction and sentencing. In a reply to media queries, an Immigration and Checkpoints Authority spokesperson says it will review the PR status of Singapore PRs who have been convicted of an offence. Ong is a Malaysian citizen who came to Singapore at the age of 4.